It was stocky, it was cramped, it had a face only a mother could love, and it was armed with enough firepower to pop the turret off a tank. Oh yes, today we are looking at the Henschel 129, Germany's often overlooked flying anti-tank gun. Entering service in 1942, it was something of a late arrival for the Luftwaffe. Its early development had been plagued by problems, and it was initially received with some reluctance. But this reluctance would be short-lived. It would never be praised for its speed, but the HS-129 was certainly praised for its potent forward firepower and its remarkable ability to shrug off damage and keep its pilots alive. This was an aircraft built around two things and two things only: maximum protection and maximum firepower. Be damned to speed, be damned to agility, be damned to looks. If it hurts, it works. And for all of its flaws, the HS-129 worked. Though it often gets overshadowed by the more numerous ground attack and anti-tank variants of the Junkers Ju-87 and the Messerschmitt Bf-110, the HS-129 nonetheless filled an important role during the Second World War and served with distinction, sometimes on both sides, until the end of hostilities. So today we're going to give this unique-looking aircraft the recognition it deserves. Its story is in many ways one of refinement, constant adjustments to make something awkward work just a little bit more efficiently. And speaking of making things work more efficiently, let's talk about Opera, the sponsor of today's video. Now, when I'm working on a video like this, I usually end up with a browser full of tabs. Archives, technical reports, production figures, photo references, distracting YouTube videos, and the inevitable, oh my god, how on earth do I pronounce this German word correctly so that my audience isn't offended? Now, Opera's features take this chaotic mess and make it far more manageable. For example, thanks to the Tab Islands feature, I can group all of my related tabs and expand and collapse them as needed. All of my HS-129 sources stay together in one tab island, my writing references in another, my translation references in a third, and my inevitable distractions are safely quarantined away in a fourth. Then you also have the split screen feature, which is brilliant when I'm cross-checking sources or comparing photos, that sort of thing. I can keep a wartime flight manual open on one side and a reference photograph on the other. There's no need to swap windows, and that way I don't lose my train of thought. Another feature I found genuinely helpful is tab traces. Now, if you're someone who accidentally ends up with 30 or more tabs open, hello, guilty, the subtle colored underscores make it far easier to see where you've just been. And because I spent an absurd amount of time staring at my browser, Opera's theme customization is a very welcome touch. You can tailor the colors, the animations, and the overall look to suit your workspace. My personal favorite setting is a darker, cooler, and calmer theme because I find it best suited to long work sessions. And of course, I set some of my favorite photos that I've taken as my wallpaper. Now, I'm honestly surprised at how much I've enjoyed using this browser. I've not really been picky on this sort of thing in the past, and I've definitely realized the error in my ways. This has genuinely smoothed out my workflow and cleaned things up a lot, especially on the larger research projects that I'm currently working on. So if you'd like to try it out, Opera Browser is completely free. You can find the download link in the description and in the pinned comment below. So thank you to Opera for sponsoring today's video. And now, let's get back to our flying tank buster. Now, the Henschel 129 went through some very specific phases of development. Because of this, I'm going to cover all of the design and technical development of the type first, and then we'll take a look at its service history. Hello, future Chris here. Just a quick disclaimer, this aircraft has a very incomplete photographic record. Photos of various prototypes literally do not exist or survive anymore, and photos of service aircraft are also very scarce or not existent either. As such, this will be a bit more like a glorified slideshow. I've not decided to do any fancy editing for the sake of fancy editing this time, as there aren't enough images to make it worth it. So consider this more of a retro episode in the theme of my older editing style. Alright. No more interruptions, moving on. The story of the 129 begins not in Germany, but over the dusty battlefields of the Spanish Civil War. For the rapidly expanding German Luftwaffe, Spain provided a harsh but very useful proving ground for its emerging doctrine of close air support. The Ju-87 Stuka had demonstrated that a properly flown dive bomber could deliver devastatingly accurate strikes against fixed positions. However, it also revealed a weakness. The Stuka was ill-suited to engaging small mobile targets, such as armored cars or dispersed infantry or fast-moving light vehicles. When the Condor Legion needed to deal with these, it relied on older biplanes, like the Hangar 51 or the Henschel 123. Their agility made them effective, but their complete lack of armor protection left them dangerously vulnerable to even rifle-caliber ground fire. If the Luftwaffe wanted a true battlefield attack aircraft for future conflicts, it would need something far tougher than a fragile old biplane. It was a line of thought that quickly filtered back to Berlin. In April 1937, the Technical Bureau of the Reichsluftwaffe Ministerium, or the Reich Air Ministry, which from now on, to keep things simple, I will refer to as the RLM, issued a requirement for a purpose-built Schlachtflugzeug, which translates roughly to battle aircraft or attack aircraft. The specification called for a concentrated forward armament of 20mm cannons and rifle-caliber machine guns, along with provisions for small bombs and smoke canisters. The RLM strongly suggested the use of the Argus AS410A engine, a domestically produced 12-cylinder inverted V producing 465 horsepower for takeoff. It was far from being the most powerful of engines, but it was readily available in high numbers and, more importantly for the worsening geopolitical situation, it required no foreign imported parts. The requirement stressed that the specification was for an aircraft designed for low-level operations where complete air supremacy had already been achieved. In other words, this was a machine expected to fight the enemy's soldiers and tanks, and not their air force. As such, no rear defensive gun was required. Instead, the RLM demanded comprehensive protection for the pilot and engines, survivability in crash landings, and the ability to operate from improvised frontline airstrips. As a frontline attack unit, the aircraft would inevitably take battle damage and would need to be patched up quickly. As such, ease of maintenance and simplicity of construction were emphasized just as strongly as firepower. Eventually, the RLM sent out their design tender to 4 manufacturers: Focke-Wulf, Gotha, Hamburg Flugzeugbau, soon to become better known as Blohm & Voss, and Henschel. Gotha quickly withdrew without submitting a proposal. Hamburg submitted a modified version of its asymmetric HA-141 reconnaissance aircraft, later known as the BV-141. Now, although this concept offered superb visibility, it was structurally complex, time-consuming to build, and powered by a single Daimler-Benz engine, the DB600, which produced around 960 horsepower. Now, this engine was powerful, certainly, but the lack of twin-engine redundancy was considered a major flaw for an aircraft intended to operate directly over the front lines. One hit to the cooling system could bring the entire thing down. Focke-Wulf offered a different approach, which was a modified version of their twin-boom Focke-Wulf 189 reconnaissance aircraft, which was already powered by 2 Argus engines. They proposed shrinking the crew nacelle, armoring it, and retaining both the pilot and the rear gunner seated back-to-back, even though there was no formal requirement for defense. Forward firepower would come from 2 MG-151 20mm cannons and 2 MG-17 machine guns, with another MG-17 for the rear gunner. Although it was closest to a ready-made solution, which would have been ideal, the Focke-Wulf 189's size, weight, and complexity raised doubts about how well it could be adapted for hard, low-level combat. Though its twin-boom layout was excellent for visibility, it introduced manufacturing and maintenance challenges that were at odds with the RLM's desire for rugged simplicity. As it turned out, Henschel would be the only manufacturer to begin with a completely new design. Their proposal, initially designated P-46, was to be a compact, low-wing monoplane powered by two Argus 410 engines, driving two-bladed variable-pitch Argus propellers. Forward firepower would consist of a pair of 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns and a pair of 20mm MG-151 cannons. The machine guns would have 500 rounds of ammunition each, and the cannons 125. These would be mounted symmetrically either side of the fuselage enclosed in metal blisters. The aircraft would also have the capacity to carry 4 50-kilogram bombs or 2 S-125 smoke generators under the fuselage. From the outset, focus was placed on survival. An all-metal construction was to be used, with a skin of light, stressed metal, armored around the central wings with 5mm of plating. The fuselage was designed around a distinctive triangular cross-section, 30 centimeters wide at the top and tapering to 110 centimeters at the base. This shape reduced the aircraft's frontal area and was intended to help deflect incoming fire. The two-spar central wing section was built as a single, heavily armored structural box that also housed the engine nacelles and the 3 main fuel tanks. These totaled approximately 610 liters and were all self-sealing to reduce the risk of fire following any combat damage. The anticipation of combat damage also influenced the layout of the landing gear, which, even when fully retracted, still allowed the wheels to protrude slightly from the engine nacelles. This would help give better protection in the event of any wheels-up landings. Pilot protection was paramount. The nose was made from spot-welded armor plates, and it contained a so-called armored bathtub to protect the pilot, essentially cocooning him in glass and metal. These days, it's a concept that is more regularly associated with the Fairchild Republic A-10 Warthog. On the HS-129, this armor was 6mm thick on the sides and 12mm thick on the front and at the bottom, where incoming fire was most likely. The sharply sloped nose theoretically gave the pilot excellent downward visibility for attack runs, whilst also providing maximum protection. In practice, however, this design would initially present something of an issue, as it included a split V-shaped windscreen made of 75mm armored glass. While this offered excellent protection, it severely restricted the pilot's view. Visibility was not the only thing that was sacrificed in favor of overall protection, and to say that comfort was not a consideration would be a huge understatement. The cockpit of the 129 was brutally cramped. Henschel had designed it to the exact shoulder width of an average pilot, and they left no spare room. The control column had to be shortened so that it could actually fit between the pilot's legs, and this would result in unusually heavy control forces for them. The cockpit was so small that the gun sight, which is normally installed inside the cockpit, had to be mounted externally because there simply wasn't any room left. The radio too was too large to fit near the cockpit, and it was installed in the mid-fuselage, as well as the first aid kit to treat an injured pilot after a crash landing, so he basically had to hope that none of his legs was severely injured after an incident, otherwise he wouldn't be able to get near any medical supplies. The initial evaluations of both the Henschel and Focke-Wulf design proposals were not encouraging. The Argus engines were simply too weak for the weight of armor that was required, and performance projections were barely meeting the minimum requirements. However, Germany had no suitable alternative power plants that were available in quantity, and the RLM still urgently needed a new attack aircraft. Thus, despite misgivings, the ministry authorized the construction of 3 prototypes from each, the Focke-Wulf 189S and the HS-129. It was, in many ways, the beginning of an aircraft that was born from necessity. Focke-Wulf got a head start in the prototyping phase because they simply reworked their existing 189 V1 reconnaissance prototype into a ground attack testbed, redesignated the Focke-Wulf 189 V1B. The conversion involved fitting a new heavily armored central crew nacelle, narrowing the cockpit area, and rebalancing the aircraft to accommodate the additional weight. The prototype first flew in early 1939, but the results were immediately disappointing. Although it used the same Argus AS410 engines as the HS-129 would, the Focke-Wulf 189 was around 20% heavier, and its structural layout meant that the extra armor severely compromised overall performance. Test pilots at Rechlin noted extremely sluggish responses in roll and pitch, a long takeoff run, and difficulty maintaining energy during maneuvers at low altitude, which is the last thing you want to hear about a prototype of a design that is meant to attack and maneuver at low altitude. The redesigned cockpit, which was far more cramped and with poorer downward visibility than the reconnaissance version, further added to pilot dissatisfaction. Unsurprisingly, these issues soon culminated in a forced landing that was caused by poor handling and marginal firepower. While the prototype was rebuilt, with the rear gunner station removed to save weight, and cockpit visibility marginally improved, it was then destroyed after it suffered a structural failure mid-flight, which involved both of the rudders detaching in midair on the 8th of November 1940. So that was the end of that. Despite being lighter than the modified Focke-Wulf 189, the Henschel 129 also struggled with the same underpowered engines and its own set of self-inflicted problems. Pilots immediately noted the exceptionally cramped cockpit, which restricted control inputs, and it made the aircraft physically exhausting to fly for extended periods. Various reports from 1930 and 1940 would criticize the prototype for heavy ailerons, difficult stalling behavior, and inadequate acceleration. Visibility through the thick V-shaped armored glass was described as poor in all directions, particularly downward, which was a serious flaw for a machine that was meant to fly low over the battlefield and shoot down at its targets. Still, the RLM insisted that development continue. After Henschel completed a series of intensive testing flights, the V1 was transferred to the Luftwaffe's main evaluation center at Rechlin in July of 1940. Meanwhile, the second prototype, the V2, had flown earlier on the 30th of November 1939, but it was then lost on the 5th of January 1940 when it crashed, following what investigators identified as a mechanical control failure, similar to issues seen in earlier test flights. Undeterred, Henschel continued and completed the third prototype, which flew on the 2nd of April 1940 and was then delivered to Rechlin for evaluation at the end of the summer. During this time, Focke-Wulf attempted to regain contention with a refined prototype, the Focke-Wulf 189 V6. This incorporated strengthened landing gear, additional armor revisions, and a twin 7.92mm machine gun installation. This improved design received the formal designation of Focke-Wulf 189C and was intended as the definitive ground attack variant. Its aerodynamic and structure modifications did improve some aspects of its handling, but it was still suffering from excessive weight, and its twin-boom construction was still considered fragile, and overall it had inferior survivability compared to Henschel's compact, fully armored center section design. The formal assessments at Rechlin concluded that while both of the prototypes fell short of expectations, the Focke-Wulf 189C's vulnerability and manufacturing complexity were major liabilities. Cost was an additional factor as well. The Focke-Wulf 189C was calculated to be roughly one-third more expensive to produce than Henschel's design. As a result, although neither design inspired confidence, Henschel's was judged as the marginally better option. Thus, with limited enthusiasm but lacking any better alternatives, the RLM chose the Henschel design as Germany's future close air support aircraft. In July 1940, a contract was issued for 23 pre-production machines that were designated to the HS-129A-0. Though it must be said, the RLM soon reduced this order to 14, reflecting its continuing doubts about the type's performance and viability. The first HS-129A was completed and flown on the 1st of August 1940, beginning a new round of service trials that were intended to determine whether the aircraft could be made into something more operationally useful. The first 7 pre-production aircraft were assigned in autumn of 1940 to Lehrgeschwader II, an instructional and evaluation unit that was tasked with developing practical tactics and determining the maintainability of the aircraft under field conditions. Service trials of the HS-129A confirmed nearly all of the concerns that were raised during the prototype evaluation. Test pilots described the aircraft as markedly underpowered, slow to respond to controls, physically exhausting to fly, and constrained by extremely poor cockpit visibility. Predictably, these shortcomings led to multiple incidents, culminating in a fatal crash on the 16th of December 1940, in which both the pilot and an onboard mechanic were killed when the aircraft failed to recover from a low-altitude maneuver. Despite the continued negative results, the Luftwaffe pressed on with further development, largely out of desperation. No other dedicated close air support aircraft was anywhere near production at this point, and with the war expanding across Europe, the need for that aircraft became increasingly urgent. After the conclusion of service trials, 2 HS-129A-0s were dispatched to Schönfeld for engine and systems testing, while the remainder were assigned to Schlachtgeschwader 101 at Paris-Orly. From this point until late 1944, SG-101 would function as the Luftwaffe's primary HS-129 training unit. Pre-production aircraft varied slightly in weight depending on the equipment. Generally, they fell between 3,200 kilos empty and 4,300 loaded, but some documents note higher numbers of up to 3,600 empty and nearly 5,000 when fully loaded. Regardless of the exact number, the effect of the underpowered Argus engines was still the same. With only 354 km per hour attainable at best altitude, and a modest range of roughly 650 km, the HS-129A-0s barely met the minimum RLM performance requirements. Although its relatively low service ceiling of 5,400 meters was not a disadvantage for its intended ultra-low level role, its weak power and labor-intensive handling made it dangerous to fly. Testing and training officers considered the aircraft unsuitable for frontline use in its current form, and the HS-129A-1 production model was ultimately rejected for this reason. Fortunately for Henschel, a solution emerged in the wake of France's defeat in 1940. The Luftwaffe suddenly gained access to large quantities of French-built Normechon engines, specifically the 14M0405 models. These were compact 14-cylinder air-cooled radials that generated around 700 horsepower. Not only did these offer roughly 235 more horsepower than the existing Argus engines, but their air-cooled nature meant that they were significantly more resistant to battle damage. With these engines now available in quantity, Henschel finally had a possible means of overcoming the HS-129's most crippling limitation. The company's chief designer, Friedrich Nicolau, initially proposed an entirely new aircraft, the P-76, which was built around these new power plants. This design preserved the armored cockpit and general layout of the HS-129, but increased the overall dimensions to match the stronger engines. Each engine would drive a 3-blade Ratia variable pitch propeller, and the new layout promised far better flight characteristics. However, development of this new design would have taken at least another year. This presented an unacceptable delay, as German ground forces were already engaged across multiple theaters, and they were planning to open a big front in the summer of 1941 with the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. With no time for a completely clean slate redesign, the RLM directed Henschel to re-engine the existing HS-129A airframes instead. The third prototype, the HS-129V3, would be the first to receive the engines and act as the basic test frame. Because the heavier power plants shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, Henschel reinforced the wings and repositioned internal equipment towards the tail to rebalance the aircraft. The modified prototype, designated HS-129V3U1, made its first flight on the 19th of March 1941. Flight reports immediately confirmed significantly improved acceleration, climb, and responsiveness. Encouraged by these results, the RLM quickly authorized the conversion of 16 additional airframes to the new configuration, redesignating them as the HS-129B-0. Aside from the change in power plant, the B-0 incorporated several important aerodynamic and ergonomic improvements. The most notable change, especially when viewed from above, was the revised wing design. The earlier kinked trailing edge and the partially swept leading edge were replaced by a straight-edged arrangement. This reduced production complexity and slightly increased the overall wing area from 28.4 square meters to 29 square meters. Henschel also responded, at last, to persistent pilots' complaints about the obstructive vertical bar that bisected the front windscreen. This was replaced by a single-piece armored front panel, and the side windows were enlarged to restore at least some level of lateral visibility as well. Now, while the cockpit remained extremely cramped, certain essential gauges, especially the engine temperature instruments, were moved outboard onto the engine nacelles. This seems counterintuitive by modern ergonomic standards, but pilots actually found it easier to glance out of the window quickly and look at the dials on the nacelles than to twist their necks awkwardly inside the cockpit to sort of look down over or between their knees. Once the conversion of the existing airframes was completed, all subsequent production was standardized as the new HS-129B1. This version, though broadly similar to the B0, received further refinements. This included open cannon troughs in place of the enclosed gun blast tubes, repositioned radio equipment within the fuselage, and a redesigned engine intake. The nose also received some minor tweaks. Combined with the new windscreen layout, these changes created the distinctive, somewhat blunt facial appearance that became the hallmark of the B series. The standard equipment for the B1 remained unchanged from the original pre-production aircraft: 2 MG-17 machine guns and 2 MG-151-20 cannons mounted in the fuselage. However, the B series quickly became the basis for numerous field modification kits, which was beginning to reflect the Luftwaffe's growing need for aircraft that had anti-armor capabilities. The most common additions were usually underwing ordnance, such as 2 SC-50 bombs or 4 SD-2 fragmentation bomblets. But far more significant was the optional installation of a 30mm Mk-101 cannon in a ventral gun pod. When fired in conjunction with the onboard 20mm cannons, this weapon could penetrate early Soviet armor with lethal effect. This upgrade marked the beginning of a sequence of events that saw ever larger cannons gradually installed on the HS-129. Impressed by the improved performance and stability of the re-engined design, the RLM would place an order for 60 HS-129B1s. 10 B0s were upgraded to the B1 standard, with a further 50 newly produced. Initial production was carried out at Henschel's Schönfeld facility, but as orders increased, manufacturing shifted to the larger Johannisthal plant to accommodate higher volume. At one point, the RLM issued a provisional order for 250 HS-129B1s that would be equipped with sand filters for the North African theatre. But this contract was cancelled before any aircraft were completed, likely due to worsening supply conditions and shifting production priorities as the war situation evolved, but also because production had already switched to a later model. Early frontline use of the B1 quickly exposed several critical weaknesses that had not been fully appreciated during testing. Most serious were the reliability problems of the Gnome Hon 14M engines, which unfortunately proved prone to sudden seizures when operating at high power or in hot weather. Reports from frontline units described frequent in-flight stoppages due to overheating, lubrication failures, and dust ingestion, issues especially severe on the Eastern Front's primitive forward airstrips and in the harsh conditions of North Africa. The engine cowlings were therefore redesigned to offer better airflow and protection, with shortened exhaust pipes intended to reduce heat soak and prevent exhaust backflow. The original round intakes were replaced with angular intakes, incorporating improved dust filters, which greatly increased the engine's tolerance to dust and small debris. The fuel system was also revised. including the addition of pressure regulators and new feeder pumps to counter vapor lock, which was another persistent cause of engine stoppage. A radio direction finder loop was also added to assist navigation to and from low visibility airfields. Aircraft incorporating these changes were redesignated as the HS-129B2, the first being upgraded airframes from the original 60 B1 order. An initial contract for 250 B2s followed, replacing the earlier order for the B1, with the first examples being delivered in May of 1942. Later production airframes also adopted a simplified radio-aerial arrangement, with the wire running directly from the fin to the upper fuselage instead of the earlier triangular mast and wire layout. The basic armament on the B2 changed little compared with the B1, but significant new options greatly expanded its anti-armor capability. One improvement was the ability to carry a single 500-kilogram bomb on the centerline rack, which was considered vital for hitting reinforced positions and bunkers. But more importantly, the earlier field kit for the 30mm Mk101 cannon was replaced with the high-velocity Mk103, which not only had superior armor penetration, but also offered a much larger ammunition supply, typically 100 rounds instead of just 30. Encouraged by the effectiveness of these weapons, Henschel and the RLM also approved the installation of the 37mm BK-37 cannon. This weapon, which was adapted from the Flak 18, and similar to the weapon used on the Ju-87G Stuka, was mounted in a streamlined gondola with a 12-round magazine. Its weight and recoil required removal of the fuselage-mounted MG-17s, but in return it gave the aircraft a formidable punch against medium tanks. The addition of this weapon marked a decisive shift in the HS-129's role. It was transforming from a general close support aircraft to a specialized airborne Panzerjäger, or tank hunter. By late 1942, this transformation became formalized. Henschel began installing the anti-tank weapon kits directly on the assembly line rather than having them installed in the field. This was in response to the increasing appearance of Soviet-built T-34s, KB series tanks, and other Soviet armored vehicles that demanded heavier firepower that the standard 20mm battery could deliver. On the 25th of May 1943, the RLM issued an ambitious delivery plan, calling for 1,635 Henschel 129s to be delivered in a variety of weapon configurations. Of these, 595 were specified to be equipped with towing cables for the DFS-230 assault glider, theoretically allowing them to deploy airborne troops in conjunction with close air support operations. However, no documentation survives that indicates that this aircraft was ever employed in this capability operationally, aside from some tests, and it was almost certainly abandoned due to practical difficulties and competing priorities. Henschel aimed to produce 40 B2s per month, but actual output fell far short, sometimes barely reaching 20, such as in September of 1942. The major cause of this reduced output, at first, was the ever-changing and often contradictory demands of the RLM itself. At various stages, Henschel was ordered to suspend HS-129 production in favor of license building the Junkers Ju-88, then retooling for the Me-410, and then later going back to Junkers for the new 388. Each switch required extensive adjustments to the production lines before inevitably needing to be reversed when things went back to the HS-129. As the war situation deteriorated, production was also further disrupted by things like Allied bombing raids, chronic shortages of skilled labor, and the increased reliance on forced labor. Abhorrent from the ethical point of view, it was also, with hindsight, logistically stupid. Laborers would take any opportunity to sabotage equipment, produce poor quality work that wasn't obvious, or otherwise find ways to reduce the output of a factory in a covert way that wouldn't hopefully get them shot. Even so, Henschel claimed that over 1,000 HS-129B2s had been completed by the end of production in September 1944. This made the B-2 by far the most numerous variant, and it accounted for more than 90% of all HS-129s that were ever built. It should be noted that although Henschel claimed that over 1,000 HS-129 B-2s were produced, it's a number that is up for a lot of debate. The final and most dramatic production version, and the one you're probably watching this video for, was the HS-129B3, which was developed in response to growing Soviet armor. This is the variant that has been responsible for a lot of this aircraft's lingering fame. The B3 has been a favorite in the scale modeling community for years. It's inspired a lot of fantastic paintings and drawings and other artworks, and it's featured in numerous video games and flight sims. All of this is deeply ironic, as only a handful were ever formally used in operational combat squadrons. But at the end of the day, when you slap a stonking great cannon under the chin of an attack aircraft, it is going to make something of a visual impression. By 1943, the Mk-103 and even the 37mm gun was struggling against the frontal armor of newer Soviet tanks, particularly the KV-1S and the new Joseph Stalin series. The RLM therefore authorized trials of a vastly more powerful weapon, the 75mm PaK-40 L-46 anti-tank gun. A wooden mock-up of the installation was mounted beneath a B-2 and tested to evaluate its effects on aerodynamics at Travemünde in May of 1944. It had less of a detrimental effect than expected. Results demonstrated that the drag penalty was well within acceptable ranges, and as a result, fully armed prototypes followed. They would benefit from lessons learned from testing this same installation on the Junkers Ju-88. 20 examples of that aircraft had been built with the gun, but they had been troubled by all sorts of problems. Weight balancing, the cannon's venting gases causing damage to the airframe skin, its undercarriage, and worst of all, its propellers, and it also suffered from early weapon jams. Now, the development and testing of this weapon for airborne use is a very interesting topic and one that really does deserve its own videos, so I'm only going to give us a sort of general overview here, as I want it to not completely detract from the rest of the video that focuses more on the HS-129 and not just the big fat gun that it carried underneath it. Compared to the troubled flights on the Ju-88, the installation and testing of the same weapon on the HS-129 went much smoother. Apart from a small amount of reinforcement being required for the wing leading edge, the engine cowling, and the canopy frame, no major alterations were required to the design. Its installation required the removal of the fuselage-mounted 20mm cannons, but the MG-17s were retained for attacking lighter targets. A new ZFR-3B telescopic gun sight would also replace the previous gun sight to enable accurate long-range fire. The weapon's massive recoil was managed by an electric pneumatic system and a huge muzzle brake. The gases and spent shell casings were ejected from the ventral gun housing after each discharge. This system had been designed so that even in very steep attack angles, there'd be no risk of the shell casings striking the airframe on its way out. The cannon itself was fed by a drum magazine that could hold 12 shells, plus another one that was held within the gun breech itself, and its fire rate was 1 shell every 1.5 seconds. In trials against captured Soviet tanks in the autumn of 1944, the weapon, now designated BK-75, proved capable of destroying virtually every target presented, including the heavy IS-2. This was the most powerful aircraft-mounted anti-tank gun of the war. It had a muzzle velocity of 932 meters a second, and it could penetrate up to 130 millimeters of armor at over 1,000 meters. It could even penetrate up to 95 millimeters at this range, even if the impact angle was at 30 degrees. Weapons tests had exceeded expectations, and as a result, series production hastily began in July of 1944. But only 23, or 25 as sources do conflict, would ever be completed. Just weeks after production began, French factories that were used to produce vital components for the HS-129, including its engines, fell into Allied hands following the Normandy landings. As such, Henschel only had enough parts to produce a score of airframes from what had already been delivered. As a result of the loss of the engine production facilities and the deteriorating industrial situation at home, courtesy of the Allied bombing campaign, all production of the HS-129 would be terminated by the end of September 1944. Now, before moving on to the service history of the HS-129, it's worth briefly talking about the unbuilt HS-129C1 and clearing up a couple of things. In 1943, the RLM placed an order for 600 or 700 of this variant, with production meant to begin in April 1944. Retaining the MG-17 and 20mm cannons of the B-2, this design would incorporate twin 30mm Mk103 cannons that would be mounted side by side beneath the fuselage. It was also meant to have a different power plant entirely, the Italian-built Isotta Fraschini Delta 12. This was an inverted V12 which produced approximately 840 horsepower. Now, a couple of textbooks I've found have incorrectly stated a much higher power output of 1200, but this engine was never officially rated above 900, so I don't really know where they got that power figure from. Regardless of this discrepancy, these engines were still an upgrade in terms of power, and so further additions could be made to the design. This would be the only variant designed to have rear defense, in response to the growing threat of Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. It would be equipped with two MG-17 machine guns that were mounted atop the fuselage and aimed using a periscopic rear-view gun sight. And yes, that does mean that the poor pilot would have to worry about performing evasive maneuvers and operating the defensive gun. Aside from the attempts at defense, the airframe's external load capacity was also significantly increased. There was provision for bomb carrying capacity of up to 1,000 kilograms for underwing bomb racks. However, it is unclear as to what specific bombs it was designed to carry, whether it was going to be 4 sets of the SC-250 or 2 sets of the SC-500. The reason why this is mostly unclear is that delays in engine delivery, followed by the Italian armistice in 1943, left this variant without a power plant. Even so, a prototype had been completed and flown in April 1943 using uprated French engines as a stand-in, and it showed some improvements, but not enough to justify costly factory retooling. As such, this essentially remained a paper project, and the type was never put into production. Beyond officially designated variants, numerous HS-129s would also serve as weapon testing platforms. Experimental armament trials would include 21cm and 28cm rocket installations, 70mm and 50mm anti-tank rockets, and even an air-to-ground flamethrower pod. But the most unusual and ambitious project involved fitting 6 vertically mounted 70mm recoilless anti-tank mortars within the fuselage that were intended to fire downward onto a tank as the aircraft flew over it. From a purely weapon effectiveness perspective, this is a very good idea, as usually a tank's roof armor is some of its thinnest. Of course, this weapon would be almost impossible to aim correctly with a human pilot. But the designers had come up with a clever solution. These 6 mortars were triggered by a magnetic sensor probe, a T-shaped device that was extending ahead of the nose that detected a large metallic mass when it passed beneath the aircraft. You know, something like a tank. The concept promised high accuracy with minimal pilot skill, which was an especially attractive feature as the Luftwaffe training standards began to decline as the war dragged on. The weapons were tested, and the mortars proved to be very effective against captured Soviet armor, but the system itself never saw operational use. Despite its ingenuity, testing with the system integrated to an airframe revealed that the magnetic trigger was very unreliable, and it was considered not worth developing further as the situation for the Luftwaffe was now rapidly deteriorating, and they needed more regular airframes sent to the front instead. Okay, now that the general development of the HS-129 has been covered, we can take a look at its service history. But I just want to reassure some people who may have thought that I've glossed over a thing or two with the HS-129 in terms of its anti-tank capabilities and developments, I am working on a separate video that is looking at German Luftwaffe tank busters, particularly the 129 and the Ju-87, and some of the details that I would talk about in that video, I would talk about in this video as well, and I don't really want to feel like I'm repeating information to you, so some things are being saved for future, so I haven't ignored it, I'm just putting it in a more relevant video. The HS-129B made its combat debut in early May 1942, being operated by Schlachtgeschwader 1. These were initially operated over the Crimean Peninsula and the northern shores of the Sea of Azov. After 4.5 months of basic training and a short working up period at the field, its units were thrown directly into combat, attacking Soviet motorized columns, artillery positions, entrenched fortifications, and troop concentrations. Operational reports describe these opening missions as being surprisingly effective. The HS-129 could accurately strike both moving and static targets at very low level, and its concentrated forward armament proved well suited to harassing Soviet vehicles. However, it was also here that the aircraft's persistent engine reliability issues re-emerged under combat conditions. In the opening weeks of the operation, several aircraft experienced overheating engines, sudden power loss, or outright seizures during their intense low-level combat missions. Some of the first aircraft were lost due to mechanical failure, but a majority of the early losses were combat-related. The majority were lost to light and medium anti-aircraft fire, as the aircraft's low-speed attack profile gave Soviet gunners plenty of opportunity to train their guns on their targets. Even so, Luftwaffe pilots were quickly impressed by the aircraft's ability to return to base with heavy damage. But despite this ruggedness, the fact remained that the 129s were too often exposing themselves to the advantage of the enemy. Pilots quickly realized that entirely new tactics would have to be developed to suit their unique mission profile. Training was redoubled, particular emphasis was placed on extreme low-level flying, and German flak gunners were used in dummy exercises to evaluate different attack strategies. Now, it must be said that all of this additional training and practice was very ad hoc. It was done on a per-unit basis, and because of that, the quality of the training was not consistent. By mid-May 1942, Schlachtgeschwader 1 redeployed northwards to support operations in the Kharkov region of eastern Ukraine. Here, the HS-129s were employed in constant close support missions, strafing infantry positions with their machine guns and cannons, and dropping fragmentation bombs on troop assemblies and light vehicles. German ground commanders repeatedly praised the unit during this time, noting that these low-level attacks had an underappreciated psychological impact on Soviet formations, especially given the overstretched and numerically inferior German forces that were operating in the region. The broad, flat-stepped terrain around Kharkov was ideal for the HS-129, allowing pilots to hedge-hop towards their targets, using the terrain as much as possible to hide their approach and strike with minimal warning. In June 1942, the first of the 30mm cannon kits arrived at the front. Installation normally required the removal of the bomb racks to offset the weight, and initial reactions from the pilots were mixed. Many doubted that a single large automatic cannon would outperform the familiar SC-50 bombs, and some were skeptical of its armor-piercing capability. But combat experience quickly changed this perception. The Mk-101 proved deadly when aimed at the flanks or rear of Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34 and lighter vehicles. Pilots learned to use a shallow oblique attack from the rear quarter, firing a short, precise burst rather than attempting massed fire. Results were sufficiently positive that the Mk-101 quickly became the standard anti-tank armament for frontline HS-129 units throughout the summer of 1942. The weapon, and the nature of its target, soon weeded out unsuitable pilots and rewarded the better ones. Though effective, early versions had just 30 rounds of ammunition, which required strict trigger discipline to not waste shells. To reduce the risk of wasting ammunition, many pilots chose to run high-explosive and tracer rounds on their 20mm cannons, essentially using them as a guide, and only firing with the larger cannon when they knew their aim was true. Some pilots, many of whom became the most successful, would not open fire until they were less than 80 meters away from their target. With an attack angle of between 30 and 40 degrees, this required excellent flying skills and near-perfect reaction timing. If the pilot didn't pull out from his attack at the right second, he could risk crashing into the tank that he was attacking. Even if he didn't, there was still a risk that the tank could explode and damage the aircraft passing overhead. That's how close some of these pilots got. But it worked. The methods were risky, but they yielded a high accuracy rate, better armor penetration, and they had the added benefit of utterly terrifying the enemy on the receiving end of it. The aircraft soon earned itself a strong reputation among both its pilots and the troops it supported, and the HS-129 found itself in continual use. In the first 3 months of operating the type, Schlachtgeschwader 1 logged over 2,500 combat missions. As the German advance pushed towards the Volga, they then supported the broad drive towards Stalingrad during the autumn of 1942. But as the weather worsened, operational challenges quickly began to mount. Heavy fog, freezing rain, and vast quantities of ice limited flying time, while attrition steadily mounted from enemy fire, mechanical losses, the weather, and crashes on ice or snow-covered airstrips. Throughout the late autumn, the group attempted to support German forces trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, flying low-level attack missions when the weather allowed. Now, as the weather worsened, the use of the 30mm cannon was abandoned as it was considered too risky to fly so low in the fog. But with a cloud base of between just 100 or 200 meters, even using light bombs was risky. This was further exacerbated by the attrition rate of pilots during this period. Because the situation was becoming critical for the German army, there simply wasn't time to give new pilots adequate training before throwing them into the fight. Pilot losses and growing mechanical issues eventually forced Schlachtgeschwader 1 to withdraw westward, and to avoid being overrun by the Soviet forces. The intensity of their operations leading up to this was so frantic, and conditions so severe, that at one point the group could only muster 10 serviceable HS-129s. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, the remaining 129 units were withdrawn for refit and retraining. Some were then redeployed back to the Soviet front with Schlachtgeschwader 1, but others were sent to North Africa, where the rapid Allied advance towards El Alamein demanded urgent countermeasures. Under the command of Hauptmann Bruno Meyer, these aircraft were reorganized under Schlachtgeschwader 2. Their first combat mission took place on the 17th of November 1942, when Meyer led an attack against a British armoured column. 2 armoured cars were destroyed, and German reports describe a degree of panic among British troops who were encountering the HS-129 and its formidable cannon armament for the first time. However, very quickly, North Africa would prove to be an inhospitable environment for this aircraft to operate. The French built Norme Rhône engines, which were never renowned for their resilience to dust, or sand, or heat, elements occasionally encountered in Africa I have been told, became a critical operational handicap. The sand filters fitted to the HS-129s were inadequate, and the engines suffered rapid wear, repeated seizures, and clogged compressors. Within only a week of frontline operations, some aircraft already had to be rotated out for emergency maintenance. By the 31st of December 1942, Schlachtgeschwader 2 had only 7 airworthy machines, and after heavy Allied bombing in the first week of January, this number fell to just 1. The rest of their time in Africa saw little improvement. Mechanics struggled to keep the aircraft operational with limited stocks or spare parts, and worsening supply lines. Additionally, the dust-laden conditions meant that even with updated filters, the engines often required replacing long before their rated service life. Reinforcements did continue to trickle into Tunisia, and HS-129s did carry out further attacks on British vehicle columns, but losses escalated sharply in the face of growing Allied air superiority. The aircraft had been designed for operations under secure airspace. With no defensive armament and mediocre climb performance, HS-129 pilots quickly found themselves at the mercy of Allied fighters. They did what they could to avoid destruction, Violent evasive maneuvers, dives into valleys, abrupt turns at palm tree height, but these were only partially effective. As spare parts, ammunition, and fuel gradually ran out, and as the Axis supply lines completely collapsed, the Luftwaffe withdrew the surviving HS-129s to Sicily in April of 1943. By this time, the steadily increasing number of Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front meant that specialist anti-armor units were now required more urgently than ever. Schlachtgeschwader 1 had continued operations on the Eastern Front, but was now in desperate need of support. In January 1943 alone, the group had lost 15 or 17 airframes, either destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Reinforcements eventually arrived, and the replenished HS-129 units were then redeployed to support Army Group A during the fierce battles of the Kuban campaign. Here, the HS-129 once again demonstrated its value. Like in Kharkov in the previous summer, pilots executed extremely low-level attacks against Soviet tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry concentrations, often striking targets with only seconds of warning. The aircraft became instantly recognizable to German ground forces, who viewed its appearance as a significant morale boost, and frontline units frequently requested HS-129 intervention by name. Flying from forward airfields only a few kilometers behind the front line, pilots sometimes conducted 5 to 12 sorties per day, responding to immediate calls for air support. The intensity of these low-level missions often resulted in heavy flak damage. However, the type's armored tub, reinforced center section, and protected fuel systems allowed many to return despite suffering serious structural or engine damage. Along with the operations in the south, other HS-129 units were committed to Operation Citadel, the massive German offensive that was intended to eliminate the Soviet salient at Kursk. Here, the Luftwaffe anticipated that the HS-129 would be essential in countering the dense concentrations of Soviet armor, which included large numbers of upgraded T-34s and the heavier KV series tanks. On the 5th of July 1943, as Operation Citadel began, more than 60 HS-129s took part in the opening strikes. Throughout the 3-week battle, the aircraft would fly hundreds of sorties, attacking Soviet strongpoints, softening up defensive positions, and targeting tank formations attempting to counterattack. According to one pilot, Hauptmann Georg Dornemann, attacks at dawn had the greatest effect. Shortly after crossing the front line, we discovered in the first rays of the sun the parked tanks with their crews still asleep near them. After my first armor-piercing rounds struck the tanks and the first of them had been turned into a blazing wreck, the tank crews sprang to life. But I and each of my pilots quickly fired off the rest of our ammunition and were soon heading back to our airfield, flying now in the brighter sunlight and already bracketed by some light flak. In this attack, our cannon fire proved devastating. 50 or more Russian tanks littered the ground, burned out or incapacitated. My own score was 3. None of our aircraft was lost in this attack, though my own was slightly damaged by small arms fire in the port wing, immediately outboard of the engine nacelle. Luftwaffe reports credit the HS-129 with destroying a substantial number of vehicles during the Battle of Kursk, though the exact tallies remain uncertain. What is certain, though, is that the losses that they incurred themselves were severe. 48 HS-129s were lost during the operation, which was one of the heaviest attrition periods the type ever experienced. Despite many local successes, including temporarily halting several Soviet penetrations, the efforts of the HS-129 units could not alter the strategic outcome, as Kursk marked the irreversible turning point on the Eastern Front. After the failure of Operation Citadel, the German retreat became permanent. For the remainder of the war, HS-129 units were engaged in near-continuous defensive operations aimed at slowing the relentless Soviet advances. During this period, several units achieved some remarkable operational figures. Schlachtgeschwader 9, for example, flew an extraordinary 10,000 combat missions in just 7 months, claiming the destruction of some 1,500 tanks and armored vehicles, plus thousands of additional soft-skin vehicles and artillery pieces. The aircraft played a key role during the evacuation of Crimea in April 1944, conducting repeated low-level attacks to break up Soviet armored thrusts and buy some time for the German forces to continue their withdrawal. However, all of these achievements were now coming at immense cost. During the first half of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost the equivalent of 15% of all HS-129s produced. One-third of this was from accidents or mechanical causes, and the remainder from combat. The combination of rushed pilot training, the rapid and constant redeployments, harsh weather, Soviet flak, and large numbers of fighter opposition placed a staggering strain on both pilots and machines in the HS-129 units. Among the many pilots who distinguished themselves during this brutal period, none became more renowned than Hauptmann Rudolf Heinz Rufer. Commanding Schlachtgeschwader 9, Rufer developed exceptionally effective low-level attack techniques using the Mk-103 and the Bk-37 cannons, and he's credited with destroying 80 Soviet tanks. His aggressive style and willingness to fly repeated sorties under appalling conditions eventually earned him the Knight's Cross on the 9th of June 1944. When he was killed in action, just over a month later on the 16th of July, during the fighting in Poland, his death deprived the tank hunting force of one of its most experienced and tactically innovative leaders. Losses continued to mount during the massive Soviet summer offensive in Belarusia in June of 1944. Two HS-129 groups, fielding a combined strength of 67 aircraft, were committed to the fighting, but Soviet air superiority, dense anti-aircraft batteries, and the sheer speed of the offensive overwhelmed them. By the end of this operation, 22 aircraft had been destroyed in combat, and another 21 had been lost to accidents, many due to frantic relocations, poor weather, engine failures, or just crashes on landing on bomb-damaged airfields. The scale of the losses during this offensive, and those of Kursk, marked the effective end of the HS-129 as a major factor on the Eastern Front. By this point, though, Germany was no longer the sole operator of the Henschel HS-129. In Romania, it would also see a brief period of service, and it would play the unusual role of serving on both sides. Before 1944, the Romanian Air Force had recognized the need to modernize, and they had purchased 42 brand new 129B2s from Germany. This number was later bolstered by additional aircraft transferred from German stocks, or acquired after emergency landings. This brought the total number in Romanian service to anywhere between 190 and up to 250 aircraft. Sources and records differ and conflict on this. Romanian pilots would employ the 129 aggressively and to great effect against Soviet tanks in Moldavia and along the Dniester front. However, on the 20th of August 1944, the Soviets launched a major offensive into Romania. 5 days later, Romania defected and allied itself with the Soviet Union. Overnight, Romanian-operated HS-129s began attacking German and Hungarian forces in Transylvania, with German HS-129s sometimes being operated in the same areas against Soviet and Romanian troops. These chaotic circumstances produced a few situations in which the HS-129s from both sides appeared over the same front lines, which created significant confusion among troops on the ground, who often could not tell whether the aircraft overhead was friend or foe, until they opened fire. However, it must be said that these situations on the whole were very rare, and some that have been noted can't fully be verified. By this point as well, most German HS-129s had already been withdrawn from the area and were now operating from airfields in Poland. Now, getting back to Germany, in the autumn of 1944, a small number of HS-129B3s, armed with a powerful 75mm anti-tank gun, were delivered to frontline units. Though tests had shown the gun to be devastatingly effective, the handful of aircraft produced were far too few to influence the course of events as Soviet forces advanced across Poland. However, they still saw some combat. During the winter of 1944-45, they supposedly flew 14 to 20 sorties, destroying approximately 9 or 10 Soviet tanks, and a number of soft targets including artillery pieces. According to reports, 2 of the tanks that they destroyed were supposedly the new IS-2 heavy tank. Though they were few in number, pilot Gebhard Weber, who flew a B-3, was astonished by the firepower it offered and the ease in which it could be unleashed. Flying with me in an HS-129B3 as my number 2 was a young pilot with fewer than 10 operational missions to his credit. On our third approach against a T-34, his shot hit the side of the tank just below its turret. The 75mm round blew a hole about 1 meter in diameter in the left-hand side of the hull, and the tank immediately caught fire. During the following operation later that day, a tank exploded after the first shot. The impact of the 75mm cannon was extraordinary. Though it was impressive, this big gun could do little against overwhelming numbers. Attrition, fuel shortages, dwindling spares, and collapsing infrastructure further eroded the operational strength of the lingering units. By late 44 and early 45, many aircraft were being destroyed by their own crews as they simply had no fuel left and didn't want them falling into enemy hands. The last surviving HS-129s did fight on into 1945, even as the German front collapsed on every side. In March 1945, Schlachtgeschwader 9 claimed the destruction of 100 tanks, 30 assault guns, and hundreds of soft-skinned vehicles, reportedly using just 6 operational aircraft. Those numbers should, of course, not be taken as wholly accurate. As I've mentioned in a few videos by now, inflated kill counts were very common on both sides. In April 1945, the last confirmed combat flights of the type were carried out over the Battle of Vienna, where the HS-129 attacked Soviet spearheads attempting to encircle the city. In the final days of the war, with fuel gone, airfields overrun, and maintenance now impossible, the remaining 129s were rendered inoperable and lingered on the ground until the German surrender. And that concludes a brief coverage of the service history of the HS-129, which by war's end had become one of the Luftwaffe's most distinctive and feared ground attack aircraft on the Eastern Front. Though it served on the front lines for nearly 3 years, the HS-129 never achieved the same level of fame or appreciation as the attack versions of the Ju-87 Stuka or the more ferocious reputation of the Focke-Wulf 190. Part of this came down to how few of these were actually built. Sources vary in figures, but it's estimated that between 850 and 890 HS-129s were produced in total. But another part of its lack of fame came down to reliability and perceived effectiveness. The reliability of its engines coloured its reputation among senior Luftwaffe officers. Some felt that other aircraft, like the tank-busting variant of the Stuka, would be superior, which is a somewhat damning reflection considering the Ju-87G was slower and didn't benefit from the same level of protection, nor the benefits of twin-engine redundancy. But perhaps more important, though, was its perceived effectiveness. It started to appear in numbers just as the tide of the war turned against Germany. It spent most of its career supporting defensive operations. Even if a flight of 129s destroyed dozens of tanks in a mission, say during the Battle of Kursk, this feat would be overshadowed by the overall strategic defeat that was suffered. Conjecturally speaking, had the 129 entered service at the start of the war, its broader reputation within the Luftwaffe may have been different. But among those who flew it, supported it, or faced it in combat, the HS-129 left a deep and lasting impression. It was a machine built with a singular and uncompromising logic to survive the point-blank brutality of low-level ground attack over the front lines and to deliver accurate and concentrated fire onto enemy targets, particularly armor. In this, it excelled. Pilots came to trust its armored bathtub, its resilient wing center section, and its ability to limp home riddled with bullet holes that would have downed many other aircraft in the Luftwaffe's service. But even with this effective design, the purpose of the aircraft would come at a punishing cost to those who operated it. The HS-129's missions demanded repeated passes at treetop height directly into concentrated enemy positions, often positions that were bristling with machine guns or anti-aircraft cannons. As such, casualties were unavoidably high, and even in periods of tactical success, frontline units were constantly drained by losses in combat, plus accidents in foul weather, and the mechanical strain of operating from improvised forward airstrips. By the final year of the war, HS-129 formations were a shadow of their former selves, reduced by attrition, starved of spare parts and fuel, and eventually displaced by the more flexible and more readily supplied Focke-Wulf 190 attack variants. The aircraft's post-war fate was equally unforgiving. Captured airframes were studied briefly and were then all completely scrapped. Today, no complete HS-129 is known to survive, and the largest remaining fragment is a cockpit section owned by a private collector in Australia, of all places. But the interesting legacy of this aircraft still lives on, both directly and indirectly. It's become something of a cult classic in the military flight sim community, and it's a popular aircraft in the scale modeling community as well. Also, the design philosophy that eventually made it famous lived on. The idea of a twin-engine, heavily armoured ground support plane, equipped with a frankly ridiculous weapon for cracking open Soviet tanks, would resurface a few decades later in the Fairchild Republic A-10 Warthog. But that is very much a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. A big shout out, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Deso Callahan 5677, who is the newest member of this special group. Now, because I am taking time off over Christmas, this will be a pre-recorded end screen, so if I do miss any new members on the screen here, please don't panic, I will update everything in January with the new upload. Hopefully, if my plan has worked out, this will be one of many videos I have uploaded in the last 2 weeks of December, as part of a sort of present for all you wonderful people, newly joined or regulars, who have supported my glorified lectures over the last 4 years. But that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.